We are very excited to have Professor Fred Miller today presenting for you on his research about Aristotle's view of business, and I really like the topic, Aristotle and business, friends or foes. That's interesting. Professor Fred Miller is a famous philosopher. He actually holds two professorships, one at Arizona State University and University of Arizona.
Yeah.
At the University of Arizona and Bowling Green State University. His teaching and research mainly focuses on ancient Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle, political philosophy, ethics, and moral philosophy. Professor Miller, he is author of several books and many papers. One of his book about Aristotle politics was published by Oxford University Press. You should look it up. It's called Nature, Justice, and Rights in Aristotle Politics. Probably I'm going to use it in my public choice class. So, without any further ado, please welcome Professor.
One more further ado.
Okay.
Another announcement. Our practice is you can get seconds even while the speaker is speaking. That's our usual practice. So feel free to get seconds if you want during the talk. We don't mean to insult our speakers.
No, I won't.
Well, now Walter can imagine. Please welcome Professor Fred Miller.
It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Economics Club for hosting this talk. Basically, what I am going to be discussing is Aristotle's views on business. And I think to set the stage for you, we can begin with kind of a puzzle about Aristotle, because when it comes to business, Aristotle is viewed in very different ways. If you go look through textbooks on business ethics, like the Journal of Business Ethics and so forth, what you find is, I think without a doubt, Aristotle is the philosopher who is most often invoked. And he's often presented as sort of a business ethics guru. And so what we find is basically one view of Aristotle, which is, this is summed up very nicely in the title of a book that was published a number of years ago and has been widely used in seminars for people in business executives. And the name of the book is If Aristotle Ran General Motors. It's by a philosopher named Tom Morris, and it contains this statement here, which I think sums up nicely the thesis of the book. It says, if Aristotle ran General Motors, he would philosophize about the crucial challenge of the corporate spirit and do something about it, so that we could attain and sustain that level of corporate and individual excellence we all want, as well as that depth of personal satisfaction we all need. So, another philosopher who's written some influential works in this area is a man Robert Solomon at the University of Texas, wrote a book on Aristotelian business ethics. So that's the one face of Aristotle. But on the other hand, we find many scholars, when they look at Aristotle, they find someone who is very critical of business practice and the system of capitalism. And I think a good example of this is the British philosopher Antony Flew. And we have this quotation from Flew. Aristotle's contention was that any gainful exchange is essentially exploitative, or he believed that the acquisition of a trader must necessarily be at the expense of that trader's trading party. So this view is basically that business exchanges are inherently unjust and exploitive. And this view is shared by many others. For example, Alistair McIntyre at the University of Notre Dame has, working on the Aristotelian tradition, has been highly critical of the system of capitalism and modern corporate practice, and seeing that it involves practices of individualism, acquisitiveness, and ruthless competition. So that leaves us with the question here: which is the true Aristotle? You know, we have these two quite divergent views, and so which correctly reflects Aristotle's views? And if one is correct, does he have any insights to offer about these practices? Okay, and as I go through this discussion, I'm going to be looking at two issues in particular, and we'll look at them in turn. The first has to do with common business practices. And the question is, are these practices morally permissible or not? And so the practices that we find in commerce, in banking, and commodity speculation. We'll look at three sorts of areas here that are specifically discussed by Aristotle. And then after we look at these in particular, I would like to look at the question of whether a business career can be morally virtuous. Apart from these particular practices, if someone decides to go into this sort of career, be a merchant or a banker or a speculator or whatever, can you do this and still retain your moral virtue? So those are the few questions we'll be looking at. Now, to begin with, since this is an economics club, I'm going to assume that most people here don't have an in-depth knowledge of Aristotle and haven't studied his Nicomachean Ethics recently. So what I would like to do is to give you a brief summary of the main points of Aristotle's virtue ethics that will form the basis for our analysis. So what I'm going to do is just offer a set of principles here, which Aristotle defends in the Nicomachean Ethics. The first is that happiness is the highest good for human beings. And Aristotle basically argues that everything we do is for some end. And you think about why do you do something, and kind of the final answer that you give for why you would do anything. Why would somebody play football? Why would they get married? Why would they have children? It's in order to be happy, to have a happy life. And so happiness is really the thing that we strive for. And if you ask, well, why do you want to be happy? That question really doesn't make a lot of sense. It just answers itself. Happiness is the ultimate end. Then the question, so Aristotle says that's something that we can all agree on. Then the question is, what is happiness? And here he develops an argument that when we look at happiness, basically what he says is, happiness basically consists in living well, living your life well. And just as if you do a particular job well, the job has some function associated with it, and you perform that function of that job, whatever it may be, with excellence. So when we look at life as a whole, life involves living well, and it involves excellence in carrying out our distinctive function. Well, what is the distinctive function of human beings? Aristotle says it's rationality. That's what distinguishes human beings from other creatures. So he ends up with this definition of happiness. It's the activity of the soul in conformity with reason in a complete life. So it's not just one day or 1 week, but doing this throughout a whole life. That's what happiness will be. Okay, the next question has to do with what's involved in acting in conformity with reason, and that's where Aristotle brings in the idea of virtue. And so he says virtue, when we talk about virtue, he talks about virtue, often this is, his term for this is often translated as excellence. And he says it's a state concerned with choice, when we make choices in life, and determined by reason. And he says the way that we make choices is we try to find a mean. We try to, when we carry out an action, we try to find what's the right amount that of whatever we're doing. So if you're thinking about a virtue like generosity, so somebody comes to your door and they're trying to collect for some charity for starving children somewhere, and you want to make a contribution. There's a question of how much should you give, for this particular charity. You've got to take care of your own family. There are other charities to be concerned with. So you have to make some rational choice. You have to find the mean. So if you just wrote out a check and gave them your whole bank account and you couldn't feed your own children, that's obviously going too far in that direction. So, and if you just slam the door in the person's face, that's the other extreme. So we want to find the mean. So that's the basic key to virtue. Okay, then the last principle is that justice is a virtue and is analyzable in terms of the mean. And what that means that is we think about an outcome as just only when the parties involved, each of them receives neither too much nor too little, but the mean, which is an equal share. So that's the basic idea of justice. Justice is going to get into this category of virtue. So those are Aristotle's 4 principles, which he's then going to apply to business practices. And so basically what I'm asking you to do is to work within this Aristotelian framework and see when Aristotle goes about applying his principles, whether he does so accurately or adequately. So now, in terms of the idea of justice, the key notion that he works with is distributive justice. And distributive justice, he says that it involves equality, but it's a proportionate equality. And so it involves people receiving shares of something in the proper proportion. So then the question is, how do we figure that out? Well, he says, suppose we have 2 people, A and B, and they are recipients, and C and D are their respective shares. And so then he says we use this formula. A stands to B as C stands to D. And then the way he spells this out is as follows. What's on the C to D side is the quantities that these 2 people, or A and B, are receiving. And the other is their merit or desert. So, for example, if you have a couple of people who are doing work, for example, for you, their work, and when you look at them, you're trying to figure out how you're going to compensate them. And one person has done twice as much work as the other person, then what's just here is the person who's done twice as much work gets twice as much compensation. So that's basically the idea here of distributive justice. Okay, now we go to the question of, are common business practices morally permissible? Okay, we're going to look at these 3 categories here. Commerce, which is retail exchange for profit. Banking, which is lending money for interest. Commodity speculation, buying goods for future sale at a higher price. Okay, so here, as we examine this, we look at what Aristotle has to say about justice in exchange. He has a famous discussion of this in a chapter of the Nicomachean Ethics. Okay, here the idea, again, he's working with a similar idea to what we had in distributive justice, where you have these 2 people working for you and you're trying to compensate them justly. Here, justice in exchange. What this involves is 2 people making trades, and there are proportionately equal traders exchange for proportionally equal commodities. So just like we had the 2 meritorious employees, and we want to give the just compensation to each. Now we're getting proportionately equal traders, and they're exchanging commodities, and they have to do it in a proportionally equal way. Okay, so here again, Aristotle uses this formula. We've got A and B are two traders, C and D are the commodities they receive. A stands to B, as C stands to B. And C and D is the ratio of the commodities received in terms of quantities. And A and B is the ratio of the values of the commodities exchanged. And so that's the basic idea of the formula. Okay, now, as Aristotle is applying this, the first real application we see of this is to barter. This is the simplest kind of case where we have two people who are just exchanging goods, carrying out barter. And here, imagine, he sets out a case here where we've got a builder and a shoemaker, and we've got shoes and houses. So they're making the trade here. And so A and B are the people trading, and then they're trading, and the builder is receiving shoes, and the shoemaker is receiving houses, so they need to swap. Okay, and here, what Aristotle says with a house is we have an exchange. Somebody's exchanging shoes for houses, and the one person exchanges a house, and then the shoemaker, in order to come up with something equal, he has to come up with 100 shoes to be equal to one house. So it turns out that A is 100 times 1 when they make that exchange, if this is to be just. So the question is, how is that possible? And so what Aristotle, the way he analyzes this is, let's suppose that the value of a pair of shoes is 1 unit, and then in order for A to stand to B is 100 to 1, the value of the house must be 100 units. So in that case, A stands to B, C stands to B is 100 to 1. So it all comes out. And the 100 to 1 here, we've got 100 shoes, 1 unit each, 1 house, which is 100 units. So it's 100 over 100, so it comes out as they're basically equal. What the house builder is giving to the shoemaker is equal to what the shoemaker is giving back. Okay, so that solves the problem theoretically, but then the question that Aristotle addresses is, what is the unit? Okay, so if justice and exchange requires equalizing in terms of a unit, we had to figure out what the unit is. And Aristotle here says well, one easy answer would be it's money. The price of the house is the same as the price of the 100 shoes, so they're equal. But then Aristotle says, well, that doesn't really solve any problem, because money is just a conventional representative of value. Money represents value, but it's not the source of value. So there must be something else that's being represented by the money, and what is it? So Aristotle then sort of, in a very difficult discussion, he tries to come up with a conclusion, and then finally his conclusion is that the unit of value is need, because the shoemaker would not enter into this transaction unless he needed a house, and the house builder wouldn't enter into the transaction unless he needed shoes. They both need the other person's product, so needs the solution. So that's Aristotle's treatment of the problem. And so then basically, assuming that would work, then we would say that a commodity's price should reflect its true value. So it's got some value in it, which is these units of need. So if the monetary price is higher than that, then that's unjust. So the implication is that a commodity has a just price, which is measured in terms of its units of value. And then this idea is something that's kind of implicit in Aristotle, but was taken over by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages and led to the establishment of various laws regulating prices of things in terms of what was supposed to be the just price of something. And there was a medieval scholastics spent a lot of effort trying to figure out how you would determine what the just price of something is, especially if goods became more scarce and the price went up. There's a question?
Yeah. Are C and D, is that, these are quantities?
The C and D are supposed to be quantities, right. And the A and B are supposed to be values. So, and the C is what A gets. So the idea is A's house is worth 100 times as much as a pair of shoes. So when they make an exchange, what the house builder gets is 100 shoes or pairs of shoes.
If C and D were the price of shoes, and you put C over D, then dollars cancels with dollars, we have a unit, let's say. The units of A and B could be need. So need cancels with need, and then you could have two ratios that make sense.
Yeah.
But if
You
you
might have
got
something
need
like-
divided by need, and that cancels, and then you've got shoes divided by houses.
Yeah. Well, the idea is it's supposed to, the value is supposed to be equal. And what, you're getting two bundles of things, and they're supposed to be of equal value. So you have some, so you imagine the price might be drachmas, so that each bundle is worth 100 drachmas. And you say, well, a drachma, one drachma represents one unit of need, and so the two bundles end up the same. But that's the way the analysis is supposed to work. Now, the major problem with this, which even in ancient times, when commentators looked at this, they couldn't make any sense out of Aristotle's idea of need. And they said, even if people enter into transactions because they need each other's goods, how can you turn need into some kind of unit which can be used to calculate the value of things? It makes no sense. And people struggle with this for quite a bit. And it's interesting that Marx refers to Aristotle's discussion of this in Capital. And what Marx says is Aristotle is very insightful in that he raises a fundamental problem. Why does exchange take place? And Aristotle's insight is that exchange takes place only if there's something equal which is getting exchanged. However, Aristotle couldn't figure out what that was. He thought it was need, which makes no sense. I have the answer. And the answer is labor. So the labor theory of value gets plugged in to solve the problem in Marx. And then basically what happens in various exchanges is that value gets extracted, labor value gets extracted, say from the worker by the capitalist, and that's the basis of the exploitation theory of value. But where Marx takes his start is with this analysis. Okay, now let's see how this, you can probably already anticipate what's going to happen when we get to commerce. So as Aristotle looks at commerce, commerce here has to do with the production of goods, he says, not in the full sense, but through their exchange. And we had a case of barter before, but now Aristotle says money enters the picture for various reasons. It facilitates exchange, and it enables us to store value for the future and so forth. And so this permits the practice of commerce. And so it says it's to be held to be considered money on the grounds that money is the unit and limit or goal of exchange. So when we, so what you have in the case of commerce is buying goods for money and then selling them for money. And if you've ever looked at Marx in Capital, he's got this formula that he uses where it's a C, a dash, an M, a dash, and a C prime. And so what happens through this series of exchanges is the capitalist as capital uses money to generate more capital. And so that's what he sees as really essentially what's going on in capitalist systems. So again, Marx is working out of this kind of Aristotelian analysis. And then Aristotle says, well, there's a problem with this. He says commerce is justly disparaged since it is not natural, he said, but is a mode of acquisition in which people take from one another. So he says, in the case of barter, he takes that to be, barter is a case where, we take goods and we use them as commodities. The shoemaker is using his shoes in order to get a house, but basically the use of commodities in barter, Aristotle takes as not really being problematic because it's naturally the case that some of us have more of some things, but we need other things, and so we need to make these exchanges in order to get ourselves in a better condition, and he says that's perfectly natural. But he says commerce isn't like that. Commerce is actually unjust because people are taking advantage of each other. They're taking from one another. So why is that? Well, think about it now. If we have a case of a merchant, and for example, if a merchant buys a house of A for 95 drachmas and then resells it to B, so now we have the house builder and the shoemaker, but now we have the merchant as the middleman here. And so he buys a house for 95, resells it for 100 drachmas, or he buys a house for 100 drachmas and resells it for 105. Either way, he's making a profit of 5 drachmas. And in doing this, Aristotle says that he is deviated from the virtuous mean, that is the just price. Because he's getting a price here which is not, it doesn't fit the actual value of the commodity. Okay, so commerce then, Aristotle takes to be inherently vicious because it involves making a profit by exacting unjust prices. Okay, the next type of practice that Aristotle looks at is banking. And here it's interesting to note, obviously, commerce has been practiced practically from the beginning of human society in some form or other, as soon as money gets developed. Banking is a more sophisticated practice, but it was actually quite common in Greece in Aristotle's time, and in fact was the major source of financing for mercantile commerce. So people who were, say, filling up ships with cargo and taking them off would basically finance them by loans that they would get from bankers. And so it played a very important role in the economy of Aristotle's time. So now let's look at Aristotle's critique of banking. So he says of the various forms of business, the most hated sort and with the greatest reason is usury. And usury, of course, was a name that was applied to collecting interest in the Middle Ages, and it was forbidden by law. And not only Aristotle's arguments were used as the basic rationale, but also it was based on the Bible as well, which says that you should not collect interest from your brother, and which was interpreted in the Middle Ages as being a fellow Christian. So you could borrow money from a Jew, but you couldn't borrow money from Christians weren't permitted to lend money. And so now Aristotle's argument here basically is that usury, here where we're loaning money for interest, makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it, for money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase an interest. So he takes this to be a misuse of the function of money. And it's interesting that that although he says that money was introduced as a convention, he sees it as having a natural object, which is not entirely consistent here. But he sees it as a misuse of money to collect interest. And because he also goes on to say money arose by convention, not by nature. He says that is how interest, takos, which in Greek means not only interest, but also progeny or offspring. got its name. So its interest is like the offspring of money. Offspring resemble their parents, and interest is money that comes from money. Hence, of all the kinds of wealth acquisition, this one is the most unnatural. And here the idea seems to be, here we have something which is a convention, and it is producing progeny. So it's like some monster that is replicating itself. And so it's not only a misuse of money, but highly unnatural form of it. Okay, so that's Aristotle's critique of banking. Now the third category is speculation, commodity speculation. And you might think that this is something which is really kind of a phenomenon of modern capitalism, but you can find that this was a practice also among the Greeks. And in fact, Aristotle himself reports a famous example of it involving the first philosopher named Thales. Thales and the olive presses. And so basically the idea here is Thales, the first philosopher, would like to spend his time speculating about the nature of the universe, the cosmos, what are the stars composed of, and so forth. And he found that no one took him seriously. In fact, there's a story about how he was gazing at the stars and fell into a well, and some woman came up and started mocking him as he was down in the well, telling him, if you're so wise, why can't you get out of the well? So, according to Aristotle, Thales used his scientific skill to predict, he doesn't say how he did it, but anyway, he was able to predict that there was going to be very favorable weather for olive growing, and that there would be a bumper crop of olives. And so Thales went out and leased all of the available olive presses. And then he says, Aristotle says, when the olive season came and many people suddenly sought olive presses at the same time, he hired them out at whatever rate he chose. He collected a lot of money, showing that philosophers could easily become wealthy if they wished, but that's not their concern. Thales is said to have demonstrated his own wisdom in this way. Now, you see Aristotle's not so impressed with this, but he says, but his scheme involves a generally applicable principle of wealth acquisition to secure a monopoly if one can. So his view is really all Thales did. This didn't take a lot of smarts. He just was able to, he was clever enough to figure out how to do a monopoly. So that's his view on speculation here, that the speculator is basically someone who is able to establish a monopoly and then can charge whatever they want for whatever good they have a monopoly over. Okay, now these are, this is a summary of Aristotle's critique of these three practices. So now the question is, we have Aristotle's ethical principles, and the question is, has Aristotle applied his own principles correctly to these examples? And to kind of dramatize this question, I'd like to perform a thought experiment. You economics, economists, economic students, and professors know that, probably aware that philosophers are generally not too interested in facts, but they love thought experiments. And one of the most popular thought experiments, for some reason over this last few decades, has been what's called the Twin Earth thought experiment. So you imagine a twin Earth which is exactly like ours with one change. So that's what I'm going to take on board here. We're going to talk about a philosopher named Aristotle-Econ, who I'm going to call Aristotle-Econ for short. Okay, this is the thought experiment. So we have, there's a twin Earth, exactly like ours, with one exception. There's a man exactly like Aristotle, except for the fact that he discovered an ancient text on microeconomics. And he decided he could make use of its analysis. So he picks up this papyrus manuscript, starts looking at it, opens the scroll, and the scales fall from his eyes. And so that's why he becomes known as Aristotle-Econ or Logos, or Aristotle-Econ for short. Okay, now we go back to the virtuous mean. As he starts thinking about microeconomics, and he says, well, wait a minute, I got to rethink these principles that I set out. Okay, so we go back to the virtuous mean, and one of the points that Aristotle made when he talked about the mean is he said that virtue involves finding the mean, and he says it's the mean relative to us, not in the thing. Well, then he thinks, what did I exactly mean by that? Well, by the intermediate in the object, what's meant is that's what is equidistant from each of the extremes, which is one and the same for all men. By the intermediate relatively to us, what is meant is neither too much nor too little, and this is not one or the same for all. So we have these two ways of understanding the mean. So, for instance, if 10 pounds of food is too many, for say to consume in a week, and 2 is too few, 6 is intermediate in the object, but not necessarily relative to us. So you can't just take the arithmetical mean. And so 6 pounds may be not enough relative to Milo the champion, who was a great Olympian athlete in ancient Greece, but it might be too much relative to some beginner. Let's call him micro. So we have micro and Milo. Okay, so now we go back to the barter example. And how do we understand that? This is Aristotle-Econ. So he says, now we look at the mean relative to Milo, it's 8 pounds of food. The mean relative to micro is 4 pounds. Their initial position is each has 6 pounds of food. However, Milo is very strong, and he's been able to go out and chop down a lot of trees, and so he has 24 logs of firewood, and Micro doesn't have any. So they agree to trade. So we have Milo and Micro. So we start out, in the beginning, Milo has 6 pounds of food, and he has these 24 logs. Micro has 6 pounds of food, 0 logs. And we swap. So, 8 logs for 2 pounds. So now Milo has 8 pounds of food, 16 logs. Micro has 4 pounds of food, 8 logs. And Micro has the amount of food that fits his mean, and also he has the logs now he can use to cook it. So now both of them are better off. And this is an example of mutual gains from trade. So this is an exchange where both of them have improved their position. They're both better off. Now often, in economists, when they talk about mutual gains from trade, sometimes it's explained in terms of the idea that value is subjective. Things have different values for different people. And so the way you evaluate these exchanges is whether you're better off in terms of that. But what I'm trying to show here is what Aristotle-Econ has found is you can make sense of this idea of mutual gains from trade in terms of the idea of the Aristotelian mean, which is what's going to be relative to each party. Okay, that's the example of barter. Now we go to the case of commerce. So here we imagine we've got a similar situation, Milo, Micro, they're in exactly the same boat, except in this case they live in separate villages and they don't know anything about each other's existence. However, there's a merchant who travels from village to village and is aware of their situation. And so, in this case, we imagine that food is more expensive in Micro's marketplace, and so it's two drachmas per pound as opposed to 1. And also, there's no market for logs in either town, so there aren't markets, logs that are available for sale. So here, we go through the scenario again. Now we have 3 parties: Milo, Emporos, who that's the Greek word for merchant, and Micro. So what happens here to begin with? Milo has 6 logs. Micro has the 6 of food, so they have the same amount of food, different logs, and Emporos here has 2 drachmas to start out with. That's his investment capital here. So what happens to begin with is Emporos, first of all, buys some food, then he exchanges here with Milo, and he's got his 8 logs. And then he takes them and trades them to Micro for 2 pounds of food, which he sells for 4 drachmas. Okay, so that's what's happened in this in the course of these transactions. Okay, now the outcome is the same, and once again for Milo and Micro, yeah.
It appears we have the Fed because we started with only 2 drachmas and now we have 4 drachmas. So someplace there were 2 drachmas around.
That's because the price is different.
No, I understand the price is different, but where did whoever it was get the 4 drachmas to buy?
Oh, well, yeah, the idea is that he just went back and sold the food in the marketplace at that point. It was able, because it's the food has a higher price.
I understand it, but if you look at time 1, the total amount of food is 12 food, 24 logs, and 2 drachmas.
Yeah.
If you look at time 4, you have the same 12 food and 24 logs, but now you got 4 drachmas.
Yeah.
So drachmas were actual physical coins. Where did the other 2 drachma come from?
Well, he sold.
Who had them initially?
He sold the 2 pounds in the marketplace for the 4 drachmas. So that's the price. What creates the opportunity for the merchant is that there's a price difference in the 2 villages. So he can, by making these maneuvers, he can make a profit because of the higher price for the food that he's getting. So anyway, but you have to make the additional assumption, as I say, that there's no market for logs here. I'm just trying to construct something where the merchant here is able to exploit this opportunity to make a profit. So we can talk about this some more. But anyway, you can see here that here Emporos, here he's netted 2 drachmas, but again, Milo and Micro are their position is improved the same way it was before. So arguably, the profit that when Aristotle says that if Emporos is making a profit, he must be taking it away from somebody. What Aristotle-Econ could say, well, no, that's not the case. What he's doing is facilitating an exchange which enables Milo and Micro to both be better off, and the profit that he's making, that's his reward for his entrepreneurial virtue. Now, go back again to the virtuous mean. Here, this gives us another aspect of Aristotle's mean. He says, moral virtue is concerned with passions and actions, and in these there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger and pity and in general pleasure and pain may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, with the right people, with the right aim, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best, and this is characteristic of excellence. Similarly, with regard to actions, there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. So the way in which the mean can be determined, time is the first one that he mentions here. Timing is obviously very important in exercising virtues like generosity, courage, and so forth. The time at which the action takes place is, can be critical. A mistimed act can be worse than unsuccessful. It can be disastrous. So here, time has to be brought in. And so now I got Aristotle-Econ, who he remembers he said this at one time, and he sees this has some relevance when we get to banking. So this is what Aristotle-Econ has to say about banking. Time preference. It's better for an agent, other things being equal, to possess a good now than sometime in the future. And so we imagine here we have a case of a banker, Formio, who has 100 drachmas, and but getting 100 plus 10 in interest next year is more valuable than keeping the 100 now. And we have Ikeon, a borrower, needs 100 drachmas for a project, current project, and getting 100 now is more valuable to him than being in debt 100 again next year. So that's the scenario. So now we imagine these two fellows. So to begin with, at the present time, here Formio gives the 100 drachmas to Ikeon, gets an IOU from him for 110. Ikeon gets 100 drachmas now, gives an IOU. And then a year from now, Formio gets 110 drachmas, and Ikeon has to pay the 110 drachmas. So that's what's happened. But as the case is described, both parties are better off as a result of the exchange. And this is possible once we see that time is relevant to how we determine the mean. That the mean, the way the mean is defined for you, may turn on these temporal factors. And for various reasons in acting, the closer the action is to the present time, generally the more value it's going to have for you. Okay, that covers commerce and banking. Now we look at speculation, what Aristotle-Econ has to say about that. Okay, now if you think about what is involved in the Thales olive press example, as Aristotle-Econ is thinking about this, one question is, well, if it's so easy for Thales to make all this money, why did the olive press owners let him take leases out so far in advance? And so one type of reason would be that they didn't want to run the risk. They didn't know if there was going to be a good olive harvest or a poor one. And so they were happy to take the leases now and issue the leases and let Thales assume the risk. And so Thales' profits could be viewed as a return for successfully assuming that risk. There's also a factor here of knowledge. Aristotle talks about Thales' knowledge. And so you could say Thales' profits resulted from a knowledge that he had, if we suppose that this story has any element of truth, that somehow he was able to predict. He could tell what the weather patterns were going to be or what have you. But here you could say knowledge is not a free value. Knowledge is costly to acquire. Thales had to spend his whole life studying nature to acquire this knowledge. And so there's a cost associated to it. Now, when this sort of knowledge yields profits, then there's an incentive for other people to gain access to this sort of knowledge. When they see, well, the kind of knowledge that Thales has could be advantageous. So that's the way we would look at the knowledge here that's involved. So it's not clear here that just the fact that Thales had this special knowledge is going to lead to the conclusion that he was doing something disreputable. Also, the statement about monopoly here, the question of whether Thales established a monopoly in what Aristotle, in the longer quote, which I didn't include here, he compares what Thales does to what cities do when they establish barriers to trade in order to increase public revenues. And it's not clear that Thales was able to establish barriers to trade. And his position, in the sense that he couldn't stop other people from making olive presses. They might not have been able to do it on the spot, but this is not the sort of monopoly that he could keep going for after one harvest, because people would wise up to it. So his position, literally, he was a monopolist, and the Greek word monopolon means single seller. But there are different sorts of monopolists, and it's not clear that the type of monopoly that he's establishing here is a type that would be necessarily unjust. And then also Aristotle makes a claim that Thales could charge at whatever rate he chose, and here Aristotle-Econ would have, after he's looked at some economics, would have some questions about that. Can Thales charge whatever rate he chose? Well, if Thales, say, charged 10 drachmas for someone to use an olive press, he might have 100 buyers. If he charged 20 drachmas, he might have 50 buyers. If he charged 100 drachmas, he might have 0 buyers. And what you're going to find is there's a certain, what Thales in fact is going to do, predictably, is to try to peg the price, since he's a price seeker, at the level that would maximize his revenue. But he's not going to be charging any price he wants here. Okay, so those are Aristotle-Econ's here treatment of these 3 examples. So the conclusions then here is that business practices such as commerce, banking, and speculation are morally objectionable, according to Aristotle. According to Aristotle-Econ, it's possible to carry out these sorts of practices with one's virtue intact. Okay, so that's the first set of issues here. Now, I'm going to be much more brief on the second set of issues here, and that is the question of, can a business career be virtuous? Here, the issue, the way we can look at the issue is, if somebody's a good businessman, is that necessarily the same thing as being a good person? And Aristotle considers an example of a kind of argument along these lines that was given by a sophist named Euthydemus, who kind of came up with this joke. He said, can a good person who is a shoemaker be bad? And then he says, yes, because the good person may also be a bad shoemaker, so that the good shoemaker will be bad. And so what Aristotle, as he analyzes this, he says the argument is fallacious because the word good and bad here are ambiguous. They don't mean the same thing when they're applied to a person as to a shoemaker. So shoemaker, we determine whether somebody's a good or bad shoemaker by whether the shoes fit. Does the shoemaker perform the function of a shoemaker well? And that's not the same thing as performing the function of a human being. So you could argue along similar lines that a good businessman is not the same thing as a good person. And on this, Aristotle-Econ would perfectly agree. So they're both in agreement on that a good businessman is not the same thing as a good person. Now, but this is the question: can a business person be morally virtuous? And here, Aristotle has an argument that even if you're a good business person, you are going to be bad. Because, and here's the reason, he says, there are 2 ways of accumulating wealth. And the word for this Greek is krimatistike. I think krimatistic is still used by, as a technical term, by economists. One way is a natural part of household management, because it promotes or preserves the natural ends of human beings, namely their survival and happiness. But Aristotle's view is that business is an unnatural way of accumulating wealth because it subverts the natural ends of human beings. It aims at unlimited profits because it erroneously treats money, which is merely the means to a good life, as an end in itself. Then I've got this quote here, which has been widely discussed, which is kind of the key core of Aristotle's argument. He says, for medicine aims at unlimited health, and each of the crafts actually achieve its end in an unlimited way, since each tries to achieve it as fully as possible. But none of the things that promote the end is unlimited, since the end itself, it constitutes a limit for all crafts. Business people have unlimited physical appetites, and hence they also want unlimited wealth in order to satisfy it. So that's a quote. Now, if you find that difficult to follow, you're not alone. Commentators for millennia have been trying to untangle this argument, but it's clear on the basis of this is that Aristotle's answer to the question is no, and he would say a business person can't be morally virtuous because there's something inherently vicious about the practice of business. Okay, now we have Aristotle-Econ now replying. Again, he's accepting Aristotle's moral principles, but he's finding some things wrong with Aristotle's argument. Okay, first of all, Aristotle had this claim that business as such has an unlimited aim. But Aristotle, the way he set out the argument, medicine does too. Medicine just has an aim of promoting health. And medicine, as a science, doesn't really care who pays for it. So the art of medicine itself is not constrained in any way in seeking this end. And here, Aristotle doesn't regard medicine as unnatural or vicious. His view is medicine is a craft which can serve the end of the good life, but it has a particular aim, which is to promote health, but the idea of the good life is supposed to indicate to what extent you pursue health as opposed to other objectives. The next point is that business, unlike medicine, sets no limit to its means, for it always seeks unlimited profit. Now here, some people have suggested, well, what Aristotle is getting at here is when you are a doctor and you're prescribing medicine for a patient, they have an infection, so you prescribe an antibiotic, you prescribe a particular amount of antibiotic and a particular strength. You don't just give them an unlimited quantity of antibiotic and pump it into them. The dosage has to be limited. But in the case of business, isn't like this. Well, again, here, Aristotle, when he says it always seeks unlimited profit, here there seems to be a misunderstanding of what goes on in the case of pricing. When you're practicing business, the way you price things is you don't put a limited profit for every transaction, and the amount of price has to be set in terms of the particular circumstances you're in. So it's not clear that that the second argument really has plausibility to it. Then the third point here is Aristotle's argument that business people always seek unlimited profits because they have unlimited appetites. And here, I think Aristotle-Econ can complain. Aristotle's really got a caricature here of what motivates a business person. I mean, it's true that some business people may be like Ebenezer Scrooge and have kind of this unlimited desire to accumulate. But a person often does engage in a craft such as business for any number of reasons. Not just because they have unlimited appetites. And so they may be doing it to support their family or to raise money for philanthropy. They may be somebody like Bill Gates who raised billions of dollars and then stopped raising billions of dollars and decided to start a philanthropic foundation and work in that area. So this third argument does not look too successful. So Aristotle Econ, his answer to the question is yes, it is possible, because none of these arguments that try to show that business is inherently vicious succeed. Okay, then we get to, finally, the question, should a business person be morally virtuous? And Aristotle's general thesis is that insofar as someone is a human being and lives with a number of people, he chooses to do virtuous acts, he says. And these acts require external goods, including bodily health and strength, education, and natural possessions. And it's the function of the crafts to provide the external goods required for their virtuous acts. Because in order to perform, we do need these external goods. And Aristotle-Econ points out that one important external good is money. And it's the function of the craft of business to provide money, which is an important external good. So Aristotle-Econ's answer to this question, his answer is yes, that this is the proper function of business, is to raise the assets to make a virtuous life possible. So again, Aristotle-Econ is somebody here who's working within the framework of Aristotle's ethical principles. Okay, conclusion. Our initial question here was, is Aristotle a friend or foe of business? And one of the problems that, not only in this case, but very often with Aristotle, is Aristotle was the philosopher. He's one of the philosophers most often cited, and he had a number of very important insights. But he often runs into difficulty when he starts with his general principles and tries to apply them to particular circumstances. And just to give you an analogy, Aristotle, in his one of his major parts of his corpus is biological writing. And so he wrote a work called The Generation of Animals, where the basic thesis that he offered there was that to explain reproduction, what we have to understand is that what happens when an organism is reproduced is that a form comes from the parent and it's implanted in material which is provided from the mother, and then the organism grows and resembles the parent. So basically what the reproduction and the perpetuation of the species involves this perpetuation of form. And he understood form as being a kind of a code which is incorporated in the material of the body. That's the basic idea. And with the discovery of DNA in the 20th century, there were biologists, particularly there was a man named Hans Delbruck who won the Nobel Prize. And when he gave his speech, part of what he said was, well, if a Nobel Prize could be awarded retroactively or posthumously, it should go to Aristotle for discovering DNA. Because he said Aristotle had the basic idea which underlies DNA theory, that it's encoded form, which is the key to reproduction. Now, when Aristotle applied it, unfortunately, he took the view that all the form comes from the father, and all the mother does is provide matter. And so the father is the one who is really responsible for the form. When you read Aristotle, it gets into all kinds of difficulty because he can't explain why do so many children resemble their mothers more than their fathers. Why do some children resemble their maternal grandmothers? And he recognized that these were problems and struggled to try to solve them. But you can see here, this is an example of where Aristotle had principles which are quite insightful, but he got into difficulty when they applied. So, question, do we have an analogy here when we get to talking about business and capitalism? We've distinguished between Aristotle and Aristotle-Econ. They accept the same ethical principles but disagree on their application because Aristotle-Econ has studied microeconomics and has tried to ally it the principles of ethics here. So, and what we find here is that although Aristotle is a foe of business, Aristotle-Econ is a friend of business. So our initial question was is Aristotle a friend or foe of business? And you can see the actual Aristotle has to be described as a foe. But you have this other character who accepts the same principles but applies them differently. So I would reach the general conclusion that if Aristotle-Econ's arguments are sound, then there's a possibility for something like a neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics, a discussion of general principles which could provide a defensible framework for modern business ethics. So that's my conclusion.
Is it possible, do you think, to press the case even further and say that Aristotle-Econ would argue that it's impossible for a business person to be vicious?
It's impossible
For a business person to be vicious. I mean, because I think what you just laid out was that it's possible to be a good businessman, but that's not the same thing as saying that a businessman is good. It could just be incidental. I'm wondering whether we can't make a stronger case for business people and say that, I mean, consider the following. You know, we got two people, A and B, they value two goods separately, they trade. If it's voluntary, that price is going to be in between their two valuations. And so you've got an automatic mean thing going on, which was at the center of Aristotle's idea of balance and the mean. Since it's voluntary, it makes both people happy, which is, of course, the ultimate aim of human existence. So any voluntary trade is therefore, by definition, virtuous.
Well, a part of it will depend on what gets packed into voluntary. So, you know, so the question would, for example, would fraudulent exchange be voluntary? So you're offering some product which has the illusion of, say, getting a person to mean, but in fact, you know, it's just a knockoff, and it's not, you know, so.
But as long as everyone is being honest.
Yeah. So so I would say that if you would have to pack more into what would count as a voluntary exchange, I think, before you know, can fit this. You know, this description, because basically the idea, sort of the base of the idea is that what's just are mutually advantageous exchanges. The assumption is that if they're mutually advantageous, that unless people are utterly irrational, they're going to voluntarily engage in these mutually advantageous exchanges. But if you have cases of fraud or whatever, then you know, that could be a case where the exchanges are unjust. Another example where you might have a problem is if you had an exchange which was constrained in various ways. So, you know, so like you're a businessman and you're able to get the government to exclude all your competitors. So you establish that kind of a monopoly by establishing barriers of trade. Then people are voluntarily exchanging with you, but would that fit the description? Now you're able to really raise the price significantly. So there would be complications here. Now you might want to say, well, that's not voluntary. I mean, it's voluntary in the sense that both parties exchange and they're maybe satisfied with the outcome, but it's constrained in various ways. So sort of the devil is in the details here. And I think that the basic idea, you know, all I'm having Aristotle-Econ argue here is it's possible for a business person to be virtuous, but it's also going to be, it might be possible for them to be vicious also if they carried out certain practices which were, you know, going to be harmful, duplicitous, or whatever. Yeah.
I want to make 2 quick points. One, you said the medieval people were saying a just price, just interest rate. my understanding, the School of Salamanca, which was composed mainly of Jesuits and some other group, I forget, they were saying that the just price is the market price, and the just interest rate is the market interest
Yep.
rate. It's interesting how the Jesuits nowadays are different from the Jesuits those days.
Yep.
The other point is, I really like your Aristotle-Econ, but I don't think you go far enough with him. I think, and maybe we can't reach the Aristotelian golden mean with profit, because it seems to me that the ideal that I get from microeconomics is maximize profits. Don't just get a little profit, and it doesn't really matter what you do with the profit, like what Bill Gates is doing with the profit. But the point is, the more profit, the better. And the higher the profit, the greater contribution you're making to society. So if I come up with a cure for cancer, and I could sell it for $1 million a pill and make a lot of profit, but I choose to sell it for only $10,000 a pill because I'm a moderate or whatever, I think I'm contributing much more to society at $1 million than I am at 10,000, because I can now have more money with which to make more pills, and I can attract more resources. So I think that we want to have maximum profits, not just a little profit.
Right. I was a little more cautious than that, though I was, trying to suggest that, say, in the case of the Thales example of the olive presses, that he, basically he's in a pricing situation. So, what he would do there would be to, he'd set the price at the level, which he could maximize the profit he would have. And I should say here, I'm glad you asked the question, because in the paper that this talk is based on a paper that's in the pipeline. It's going to be in a collection on business ethics. But in the discussion of speculation here, I made quite a bit of use of Professor Bloch's work on speculation. Found it quite helpful. And one of the things that you point out in your work is that a speculator, suppose you've got somebody like Thales, as I mentioned, his knowledge is that's a valuable commodity, and so if you can show that it produces these benefits, that's an incentive for other people to acquire that kind of knowledge. And even if Thales is unique and he's got this great mind so other people aren't really in the position where they can become a Thales themselves, still Thales, by making profits, performs an important function. It serves as like I think you described it as like an advanced alarm signal or something like that. So in that regard, Thales would be like somebody like Warren Buffett, who is like this, nobody else can be Warren Buffett, but he knows how to make calls, and you have all kinds of people who imitate Warren Buffett. When he moves, they all move. They don't know why he's doing what he's doing, but they dive in as well. Because he's proven that he's got this ability. So if you've got Thales proceeding, in making provisions for some tidal wave, that's going to hit Anatolia, that should be a signal to other people that this is valuable information. And if he didn't make a profit out of it, that would be basically. That would be knowledge that would be lost. So, anyway, so that's, I think those are arguments that could be given. Yeah.
I wanted to turn to the Thales story.
Yes.
And maybe take Aristotle's side to a certain extent against Aristotle-Econ. It seems to me that Aristotle-Econ wants to make the argument that market forces can control the price, but in fact, market forces can control the price only within certain parameters and not entirely. For instance, Thales could, as it were, squeeze his customers just like he would squeeze the olives to a certain extent. But some of that squeezing, although possible and allowed by market forces, would not, by Aristotle's account, be just, because he would be making more for his work than is by distributive justice proportion. And it would sit, and along those lines, do feel that perhaps Aristotle views the businessman in the strict sense, much as Socrates at the end of Book 1 of the Republic talks about doctors and rulers in the strict sense, and that it's in the strict sense that he has some intentional business person, not as in its entirety as a human being.
Yeah, well, I think the question here is, yeah, I think there's a difficult question here of when someone is in a position that Thales is in. Now, they're going to be charging a higher price than, say, the people would have paid, you know, if they ordinarily rented the olive presses. So they may end up paying twice as much as they would otherwise. Now, the question is whether, yeah, as a result of this speculative activity. Now, the question is, does that make Thales price gouger or not in this particular case? So the fact that you're charging more than would have otherwise been the case if you hadn't been there and anticipated this, I don't think that necessarily makes somebody a price gouger, that by itself. But the question is whether there's something coercive about, you know, what Thales would be doing.
I mean, if he makes it such that his customers' children can't buy new shoes when they need them, even though they still can live, that would make, of course, distributive justice would seem unjust. Whereas if Thales simply did what he did to prove his point that philosophers aren't stupid people, and nonetheless, once he gained his point, charged justly and no more than the individuals had they not been in monopoly, then he would maintain justice both for himself and for
yeah, I think here we have to go back to the kind of arguments that Aristotle-Econ is using, several of which I borrowed from Professor Block. And the question is a speculator performing a valuable function, social function? Because by acting on their knowledge, they're affecting prices in various ways, you know, anticipating what's going to happen. So, you know, and that is sending all kinds of messages throughout the economy. So, like when the price of coffee goes up, there's a message there. Now, if you were to ban all speculation, that would mean basically, you know, none of that kind of information would come out. Since there wouldn't be any return on anticipating future developments, you could expect there would be much less anticipation of future developments, you know, of what the prices of commodities are going to be 6 months from now, a year from now, or whatever. So what that suggests is that in fact there is a value which is being, the speculator is doing this and making a profit out of it, but there's a value that, you know, that is being provided as well as, you know, just making a profit. Yeah.
Okay, I'm really sorry we are out of time. There's another class starting. Thank you so much for